Number 1. Philip Chisholm. She was a young, well-loved math teacher who stayed late to help her students. He was a quiet 14-year-old who had just moved from Tennessee to Massachusetts, trying to adjust to a new school and a new life. On the surface, nothing seemed unusual about their paths crossing, but on an October afternoon in 2013, what started as an ordinary day at Danvers High School ended in one of the most shocking crimes ever linked to a student so young. Philip Chisholm had recently arrived in Danvers with his mother after his parents' divorce. Teachers described him as polite but reserved. He had a passion for soccer and was considered talented on the field. Yet classmates noticed he often kept to himself, with some later recalling that he seemed withdrawn. Colleen Ritzer, by contrast, was only 24, but already a beloved figure at the school. She was known for her patience, her energy, and her ability to connect with students. She often stayed after class to offer extra help. On October 22, 2013, that willingness to give her time set the stage for tragedy. That afternoon, Ritzer asked Philip to stay behind after math class. Security footage shows the two walking out into the hallway together. What no one could have predicted was the series of events that followed. As other students went home, Philip remained at school, and surveillance cameras later captured him following Ritzer down the hallway toward the bathroom area. Moments later, she would never be seen alive again. When Colleen failed to return home that night, her parents became worried. She was responsible and dependable, the kind of person who always checked in. Her car was still parked at the school. By evening, police had launched a search. Meanwhile, Philip's mother had also reported him missing, unaware of what he had done. Officers soon discovered that he too had disappeared from the school. That raised suspicions immediately. The breakthrough came when investigators reviewed the school's security tapes. They saw Philip trailing behind Colleen, then re-emerging alone wearing different clothes and carrying a large recycling bin. In the early hours of the morning, search teams combed the wooded area behind the school. There they discovered Colleen's body. Nearby lay her belongings, including her teaching materials. Evidence at the scene and in Philip's possession pointed directly to him. Philip was picked up in the early morning hours walking along a road. He had Colleen's credit cards and some of her belongings with him. Police took him into custody, and as the evidence was pieced together, the case became undeniable. A 14-year-old boy had taken the life of his teacher in a calculated act that stunned not just the community of Danvers, but the entire nation. When the case moved into the courtroom, it drew enormous attention. How could someone so young commit such a brutal crime? Prosecutors painted a picture of premeditation. They relied on the surveillance video, physical evidence, and witness accounts from classmates. The defense argued Philip was struggling with severe mental health issues and was not fully aware of his actions. His lawyers pushed for the jury to consider his age and state of mind, suggesting he should not face the maximum penalties. The trial revealed chilling details of the crime, though much was kept out of public record to preserve the dignity of the victim. Jurors were left to grapple with the question of intent. After days of testimony, they reached a verdict. Philip Chisholm was convicted of first-degree murder, along with additional charges of aggravated assault and armed robbery. In 2016, he was sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 40 years. Because of his age at the time of the crime, Massachusetts law prevented a sentence of life without parole. For Colleen's family, the verdict brought some measure of closure, but not relief. Her parents spoke of the bright future she had, cut short by one of her own students. For the community of Danvers, the case left deep scars. Teachers began reconsidering how safe they felt staying late with students. Parents struggled to explain to their children how something like this could happen inside a school that was supposed to protect them. Today, Philip Chisholm remains in prison, serving what will likely be the majority of his life behind bars. Colleen Ritzer's legacy, however, lives on. Her family established scholarships in her name to support students pursuing teaching careers, ensuring her love of education continues to inspire others. The story of Philip Chisholm is not just one of crime, but of contrast. A promising teacher whose dedication became her undoing, and a teenager whose silence hid a darkness no one around him could see. It raises haunting questions about how much we can ever know the people around us, and how, sometimes, the most ordinary settings can conceal the most extraordinary dangers. Number 2. Aidan Fucci. She was a bright, energetic 13-year-old who loved cheerleading and was known for her kindness. He was a classmate, only a year older, who came from the same community and walked the same streets. On Mother's Day in 2021, the quiet suburb of St. Johns County, Florida, became the center of national attention when one of the youngest and most shocking cases in recent history unfolded. Tristan Bailey lived with her parents and siblings in a close-knit neighborhood. She was popular among friends and admired for her strong spirit. Her family often described her as a girl with drive, someone who never gave up on her goals. Aidan Fucci, then 14, lived nearby. He was in the same school, but unlike Tristan, classmates later said he was sometimes troubled and often drawn to darker conversations. Even at that age, there were reports that he spoke about violence and fantasies of hurting others. Most people didn't take him seriously. On the evening of May 8, 2021, Tristan spent time with friends in her neighborhood. Late at night, she was last seen leaving with Aidan. Surveillance cameras and witnesses later confirmed the two walked together in the early morning hours. That was the last time anyone saw Tristan alive. When she didn't return home the next morning, her family grew alarmed. They reported her missing, and within hours, the community mobilized. Volunteers searched fields, wooded areas, and retention ponds. Flyers and social media posts spread her picture quickly. The turning point came when investigators obtained neighborhood surveillance video. It showed Aidan and Tristan walking together around 1:15 a.m. Roughly 2 hours later, another camera captured Aidan walking alone, carrying his sneakers in his hands. His clothing looked disheveled, and something was clearly wrong. This footage, combined with his inconsistent statements to investigators, immediately raised suspicion. By later that afternoon, Tristan's body was discovered in a wooded area not far from her home. When deputies questioned Aidan, he initially denied knowing what had happened, but in the back of the patrol car, a chilling moment occurred. While recording himself on Snapchat, he made a comment asking if anyone had seen Tristan recently, smirking into the camera. That video would later become part of the public record and sparked outrage nationwide. Investigators soon recovered physical evidence linking him to the crime, including his clothing and the weapon used. The case quickly gained national attention, not only because of the ages of those involved, but also because of the brutality and apparent lack of remorse. Prosecutors argued that Aidan had planned the attack, pointing to his history of disturbing comments to friends. Defense attorneys, however, emphasized his age, claiming he was immature, unstable, and not fully capable of understanding the consequences of his actions. Despite his youth, prosecutors made the decision to charge him as an adult. In early hearings, Aidan appeared in court in an orange jumpsuit, often looking expressionless. The Bailey family, in contrast, filled the courtroom with a sea of teal, Tristan's favourite colour, wearing matching shirts to show unity and strength. The community's grief was palpable, and the question everyone wrestled with was how a boy of 14 could carry out such a calculated act. In February 2023, Aidan Fucci pleaded guilty to first-degree murder. The plea avoided a lengthy trial, but it didn't spare him from the harshest of sentences. During the sentencing hearing, the Bailey family gave emotional statements describing the devastating loss of a daughter and sister. Prosecutors presented evidence of Aidan's planning and his fascination with violence. The judge ultimately sentenced him to life in prison, with the possibility of review after 25 years, as required by law for juvenile offenders. The sentencing hearing was broadcast widely, with many focusing on Aidan's lack of reaction as the punishment was read. For the Bailey family, while justice had been served, it could never replace the vibrant life of Tristin. Her cheer team and school honoured her memory with tributes, and her family continues to speak about the importance of protecting children and raising awareness about warning signs. Today, Aidan Fucci remains in a Florida prison, serving what will likely be most of his life behind bars. The case remains a reminder of how quickly a community can be shattered, how fragile trust can be, and how even in the most ordinary settings, unimaginable acts can take place. Tristin Bailey's name is now remembered not just in sorrow, but also in the way her family and community came together in her honour. Her legacy, marked by strength and resilience, continues to live on, even as the boy who took her life grows into adulthood behind prison walls. Number 3. Jamie Silverneck. At first glance, Jamie Silverneck looked like any other 14-year-old in Lehigh County, Pennsylvania. She went to school, hung out with friends, and used social media to document her life. But in March of 2015, her name would become known across the nation, not for teenage innocence, but for a crime so disturbing that it left an entire community reeling. Jamie's life seemed typical on the outside. She was in 8th grade, came from a suburban family, and was described by classmates as outgoing and lively. But beneath the surface, Jamie was leading a secret life. She had started a relationship with a man nearly twice her age, a 20-year-old soldier named Caleb Barnes. The connection began through social media and quickly escalated. Jamie, only a young teenager, convinced herself that she and Barnes were in love. For her, he was a kind of escape from the rules of home and the normal limits of being 14. Her mother, Cheryl Silverneck, became increasingly worried. Cheryl tried to intervene, warning her daughter that the relationship was inappropriate and dangerous. But instead of listening, Jamie began to view her mother as the obstacle standing in the way of the romance she wanted to keep. This conflict escalated until Jamie made a shocking decision. She would eliminate her mother. On the night of March 13th, 2015, Jamie, Caleb, and Cheryl went out to a concert together. Cheryl likely believed she was supervising her daughter while also keeping an eye on the older boyfriend. But after the show, the situation turned deadly. In the family SUV, Caleb attacked Cheryl in the passenger seat while Jamie sat in the back. Prosecutors later revealed that Jamie encouraged him and even helped by handing him what he needed during the attack. Within moments, Cheryl was gone. The pair now faced the problem of what to do next. In the early morning hours, they drove Cheryl's body to a wooded area near Allentown. There they attempted to cover up what had happened by concealing the evidence. They returned home and tried to act as though nothing had changed. But Cheryl's absence was immediately noticed. Friends and relatives became alarmed when she didn't answer her phone or return messages. Investigators quickly focused on Jamie and Caleb. Neighbours reported seeing the soldier with the teenager, and Jamie's social media messages revealed the depth of their relationship. When police interviewed Jamie, her story was inconsistent. She tried to downplay her involvement, but evidence from her phone and from Caleb's testimony revealed the truth. The couple had planned Cheryl's death in advance. The arrest made headlines across Pennsylvania and soon the country. People were stunned that a girl so young could be wrapped up in such a crime and that she would turn against her own mother. Reporters flooded the courthouse, documenting every hearing. Prosecutors charged Jamie as an adult, pointing to the seriousness of the crime and her role in helping plan it. During the trial, the defense argued that Jamie was manipulated by an older man who had groomed her and convinced her to take part. They painted her as a vulnerable teenager who was overwhelmed by pressure and infatuation. But prosecutors countered with the cold reality of her own words. Text messages between Jamie and Caleb showed her discussing the plan, encouraging him, and later expressing relief that her mother was gone. Faced with overwhelming evidence, Jamie eventually entered a guilty plea to third-degree murder, criminal conspiracy, and evidence tampering. In 2016, a judge sentenced her to 35 years to life in prison. Because of her age, she will one day have the chance for parole, but that possibility won't come until she is much older. Caleb Barnes, tried separately, was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life without parole. The courtroom scenes were emotional. Cheryl's family spoke of the devastation caused by losing a mother, a wife, and a friend in such a shocking way. The betrayal cut deep. Not only had she been taken, but it was her own daughter who had stood by as it happened. The judge remarked on the seriousness of Jamie's actions, noting that while she was young, her decisions had permanent consequences. Today, Jamie remains behind bars, serving out her sentence. From prison, she has written letters expressing remorse and claiming she now understands the gravity of her choices. Whether those words are sincere is something only she knows. What cannot be erased is the life of Cheryl Silverneck, cut short by the very person she had raised and protected. The story of Jamie Silverneck lingers because it strikes at the heart of what feels unthinkable: a child betraying a parent. It forces us to ask uncomfortable questions about influence, about manipulation, and about how far young people can be drawn into destructive paths. At 14, Jamie should have been worrying about school dances, exams, and friendships. Instead, she became the center of one of Pennsylvania's most shocking cases, a reminder that even the people closest to us can sometimes hold the darkest secrets. Number 4. Paul Henry Gingerich. On a spring evening in 2010, a quiet town in Indiana became the backdrop for one of the youngest defendants ever tried as an adult in American history. The name Paul Henry Gingerich would be repeated across news outlets and courtrooms because he was only 12 years old when he helped carry out a crime that stunned even seasoned investigators. Paul grew up in Cromwell, a small town where families knew each other and children rode their bikes down tree-lined streets. He was a sixth grader, described as polite and mild-mannered, though he had begun spending more time with older boys in the neighborhood. At that impressionable age, he was easily swayed by the people he saw as role models. One of those figures was Colt Lundy, a 15-year-old who lived nearby. Colt was older, had a car, and seemed to live with fewer restrictions. To Paul, he represented excitement and freedom. In April 2010, Colt began speaking about escaping from his home and starting a new life. His father, Phil Danner, had rules that Colt resented, and soon the conversations turned dark. Colt told Paul and another boy, Chase Williams, about his plan to kill his stepfather. At first, it may have sounded like teenage bravado, but within days the talk became action. Colt convinced Paul to take part, framing it as the only way they could run away together. On April 20th, 2010, the plan was set in motion. Colt, Paul, and Chase gathered inside Colt's house. While Chase acted as a lookout, Paul and Colt waited for Phil Danner to arrive home. When he stepped through the door, the boys were waiting with handguns. In a matter of seconds, shots were fired, and Phil fell to the floor. He died in his own living room, betrayed not only by his stepson, but also by the 12-year-old friend who pulled the trigger alongside him. The boys immediately fled the house, attempting to put their escape plan into action. Their destination was Arizona, where they imagined starting a new life away from rules and parental control. They piled into Colt's stepfather's car and set off on the road. But their journey did not last long. Police were quickly alerted, and within hours the teenagers were located and taken into custody. For law enforcement, the shock was not only in the crime itself, but in the ages of the suspects. The investigation revealed the disturbing details of the plot. Text messages, witness accounts, and the boys' own statements showed that the murder had been discussed days in advance. It wasn't a spur-of-the-moment act, but a plan carried out by adolescents who barely understood the consequences. For prosecutors, the question was not just what had happened, but how to handle defendants so young. Initially, Paul was charged as an adult, a move that sparked controversy across Indiana and beyond. Critics argued that at 12 years old, he could not fully grasp the weight of his actions, while prosecutors insisted the seriousness of the crime demanded adult charges. His case drew statewide and even national attention, as it tested the balance between juvenile justice and accountability for violent crimes. In 2011, Paul reached a plea deal. He admitted to conspiracy to commit murder and was sentenced to 30 years, with the first part to be served in a juvenile facility and the remainder potentially in adult prison. This unusual arrangement reflected the court's struggle to handle someone so young. Over time, appeals and advocacy led to changes. In 2014, the Indiana Court of Appeals ruled his sentence unconstitutional, and by 2017, Paul was resentenced to 10 years in juvenile custody, followed by probation, recognizing that rehabilitation was possible. Throughout the legal process, Paul expressed remorse. He admitted that at 12 he had been easily manipulated, caught up in Colt's charisma, and unable to resist peer pressure. Supporters argued that he was a child who had made a terrible mistake, not an irredeemable criminal. Still, for the family of Phil Danner, the loss was permanent, and no legal outcome could erase their grief. Today, Paul Henry Gingerich has served his time in juvenile facilities and has been released under strict supervision. His case is often cited in discussions about juvenile justice reform. It illustrates the dangers of trying young offenders as adults, while also reminding the public that even children are capable of devastating choices when pushed into the wrong influences. The story of Paul Gingerich remains unsettling because it blends childhood innocence with adult consequences. At 12, most kids are focused on school projects or sports, yet he was standing in a courtroom facing decades in prison. His case forces us to reflect on how quickly childhood can be lost, how dangerous peer influence can become, and how the justice system should respond when the line between youth and responsibility is blurred by tragedy. Number 5. Antonio Barbo. In September of 2012, the quiet town of Sheboygan Falls, Wisconsin, became the setting for a crime that seemed unthinkable. At just 13 years old, Antonio Barbo was accused of taking part in the death of his own great-grandmother, a woman who had loved and cared for him. The case stunned the community not only for the brutality of the act, but for the age of those involved. Antonio came from a family with its struggles, but those who knew him never expected violence. He was described as a typical middle schooler, someone who enjoyed hanging out with friends and playing games. But beneath the surface, he had begun to drift, spending more time with another boy his age, Nathan Papi. The two would talk about frustrations, about money, and eventually about crime. What started as idle conversation soon spiraled into planning something far darker. Their target was Antonio's great-grandmother, Barbara Olson. She was 78 years old, living alone, and known for her generosity. Antonio knew she kept some money in her house, and in the minds of these young boys that became a motive. On September 17th, 2012, they skipped school and walked to her home. What unfolded that day would shock even experienced investigators. Prosecutors later revealed that Antonio and Nathan had armed themselves with a hatchet, a hammer, and a knife. When they entered Barbara's house, the plan turned deadly. They attacked her in her own living room, leaving her fatally injured. They then ransacked the house looking for cash, taking only a small amount and her car keys. Their attempt to drive away in her vehicle ended quickly when they crashed into a ditch, forcing them to abandon it. What they had imagined as a path to money and freedom collapsed almost immediately. When Barbara Olson failed to answer calls or appear for church, her body was discovered by family members who went to check on her. The scene was devastating. Police were quickly called, and suspicion turned to Antonio when it was revealed that his great-grandson had been seen near the home. Within days, both Antonio and Nathan were arrested. Despite their young ages, the evidence against them was overwhelming. The weapons, the stolen car, and their own confessions. The case drew extensive media coverage because of the boys' ages. How could two middle schoolers commit such a crime against a family member, and why? Prosecutors faced the difficult decision of how to charge them. In Wisconsin, children as young as 10 can be tried in adult court for serious offences. Both boys, at just 13, were charged with first-degree intentional homicide. Court proceedings were heavily covered, with reporters filling the courtroom as these two young teens appeared in orange jumpsuits, often looking small and overwhelmed at the defense table. The defense teams argued that the boys were immature, incapable of fully understanding their actions, and should be treated within the juvenile system. The prosecution emphasized the severity of the crime and the need for accountability. In 2014, Antonio Barbeau entered a plea deal. He pleaded no contest to first-degree intentional homicide. The judge sentenced him to life in prison with eligibility for parole after 35 years. That means he will not even be considered for release until he is in his late 40s. Nathan Pape, tried separately, was found guilty by a jury and received a similar sentence. For the family, the tragedy was twofold. They had lost a beloved grandmother, and at the same time, a 13-year-old relative was locked away for life. Barbara Olson was remembered as a kind woman who always helped those around her, a churchgoer who welcomed her great-grandson into her home without hesitation. That trust was betrayed in the worst possible way. Today, Antonio serves his sentence in a Wisconsin prison. His case continues to be cited in debates about juvenile justice, the role of peer influence, and whether children that young can ever truly grasp the permanence of their actions. What began as talk between friends ended in a crime that shocked an entire state and left a family forever changed. The story of Antonio Barbeau forces us to reflect on the vulnerability of family bonds and the danger of youthful impulses when combined with poor judgment and dark influence. At 13, he was old enough to know right from wrong, but far too young to truly understand the lifetime of consequences that would follow. And now, as he grows into adulthood behind prison walls, the memory of his great-grandmother's generosity will forever stand in stark contrast to the decision he made that September day. Number 6. Lionel Tate. In 1999, a case out of Florida would ignite national debate about how the justice system treats children. At its center was Lionel Tate, a boy who was only 12 years old when he was convicted of a crime that made him the youngest American ever sentenced to life in prison. His story, and the questions it raised, remain one of the most infamous examples of juvenile justice in U.S. history. Lionel grew up in Broward County, Florida. He was the son of a single mother who worked as a Florida highway patrol officer. By most accounts, he was an active, energetic boy who loved sports and professional wrestling. Friends and family described him as playful and sometimes rambunctious, like many children his age. But on July 28, 1999, what began as a night of babysitting turned into a tragedy that shocked the nation. That evening, Lionel's mother was at work, leaving him in charge of 6-year-old Tiffany Unick, a family friend. Lionel and Tiffany played together in the living room while his mother was away. Hours later, Tiffany was gravely injured. When paramedics arrived, it was too late. Lionel told investigators that he had been imitating wrestling moves he had seen on television. He claimed that Tiffany had accidentally been hurt during what he thought was play. But the extent of Tiffany's injuries suggested far more than a simple accident. The medical examiner found extensive damage, including broken bones and internal trauma. For prosecutors, these findings indicated a sustained and violent assault rather than a single mishap. The state charged Lionel with first-degree murder. The decision stunned many, a 12-year-old facing the same charge as an adult in a homicide case. The trial drew enormous media attention. Prosecutors argued that Lionel had intentionally inflicted fatal injuries, emphasizing the severity and number of wounds. The defense countered that he was only a boy reenacting moves he had seen on television, lacking the understanding of how dangerous his actions were. They stressed that he had no prior history of violence and that he did not fully comprehend death or injury. In January 2001, a jury found Lionel Tate guilty of first-degree murder. In March, the judge handed down a life sentence without the possibility of parole. At the time, it was the harshest penalty ever given to someone so young in the United States. The decision sparked outrage across the country and even internationally. Critics argued that sentencing a 12-year-old to life behind bars ignored the possibility of rehabilitation. Supporters of the sentence insisted that the seriousness of the crime required accountability regardless of age. The case became a flashpoint in discussions about children and the law. News networks, talk shows, and legal experts debated whether Lionel should have been tried as an adult. Human rights organizations and child advocacy groups called the sentence cruel and unusual. Even professional wrestlers spoke publicly, expressing regret that their entertainment product had been linked to such a tragedy. In 2004, after years of appeals, a Florida appeals court overturned Lionel's conviction. Judges ruled that he had not received a fair trial because his mental competency had not been properly evaluated. A plea deal was reached, and Lionel was released after serving 3 years in juvenile custody. At that point, he was still only 17. His release reignited debate, with some feeling justice had been undone, while others saw it as a second chance for a child who never should have faced adult punishment in the first place. Unfortunately, Lionel's story did not end there. In the years following his release, he found himself repeatedly in trouble with the law. In 2005, he was arrested for threatening another child with a knife. In 2006, he was caught violating probation. And in 2008, he was convicted of armed robbery and probation violations, resulting in a 30-year prison sentence. These later crimes seemed to confirm the fears of those who believed he was dangerous, while also deepening the tragedy of a boy who had once been the subject of national sympathy. Today, Lionel Tate remains incarcerated, serving his 30-year sentence in the Florida prison system. Tiffany Unick's family has had to live with the painful reality that their daughter's life was cut short, while Lionel's life became defined by one moment of violence and the troubled years that followed. The case of Lionel Tate stands as one of the most important examples in the history of juvenile justice. It forces us to confront difficult questions. Should a 12-year-old be punished like an adult? Can children truly grasp the weight of their actions? And when society chooses to impose the harshest penalties, what does that say about our belief in rehabilitation? For some, Lionel's story is a warning about the dangers of violence, even when framed as play. For others, it is a cautionary tale about a justice system that struggled to balance accountability with compassion. Nearly a quarter century later, the name Lionel Tate still represents the complex and often heartbreaking challenge of dealing with children who commit the most serious crimes. Number 7. Noah Crooks. In a quiet rural town in Iowa, the Crooks family seemed ordinary. They lived in a modest home surrounded by farmland where life moved slowly and neighbors knew one another. Inside that home, however, a storm was brewing between a 13-year-old boy and his mother. On March 24, 2012, that storm broke in a way that would leave investigators stunned and a community shaken. The name of that boy was Noah Crooks. Noah was, on the surface, a typical middle schooler. He enjoyed video games and sports and was described by classmates as energetic, sometimes impulsive, but not particularly unusual. Teachers noted he was smart, but often restless in class. Like many boys his age, he pushed against authority at home, testing boundaries with his mother, Gretchen. She was a nurse, hard-working, and determined to raise her son with discipline and care after his father's long absences for work. Friends of the family later said she was patient and deeply committed to her only child. But in the months leading up to that spring evening, Noah's relationship with his mother became strained. Reports later showed that he had exhibited signs of defiance and outbursts, and his mother tried to set firm rules to keep him in line. Noah grew frustrated, feeling she was too strict, and that resentment began to fester. On March 24th, it exploded. That evening, a chilling call came into 911. On the line was Noah himself. His voice, still that of a child, admitted to what had just happened inside the family home. The recording of that call later became central to the case, as Noah calmly described how he had taken a rifle and turned it on his mother. Investigators who arrived at the scene confirmed the unimaginable. Gretchen was gone, and her 13-year-old son had been the one to end her life. The discovery left law enforcement and neighbors in disbelief. In small-town Iowa, crimes of this magnitude were rare. For it to be committed by a boy barely in his teens was even more shocking. The 911 call spread quickly through media reports, and soon the case was being covered across the country. Questions swirled. What could drive a boy so young to take such an irreversible step? The investigation revealed that Noah had used a semi-automatic rifle kept in the home. He admitted to firing it at his mother after an argument, and he made no attempt to flee the scene. Instead, he called 911 and confessed, telling dispatchers what he had done. That act of phoning for help provided prosecutors with one of the most direct confessions possible, leaving little room for doubt about his involvement. The case moved into the courtroom, where Noah, just a teenager, now faced charges that could put him away for most of his life. Prosecutors charged him with first-degree murder, arguing that the crime was deliberate. They emphasized his admission, the preparation involved in retrieving the firearm, and the fact that he had not acted in self-defense or in the heat of passion. The defense, meanwhile, focused on his age and emotional state. They described a boy overwhelmed by anger and immaturity, someone who did not fully understand the weight of his actions. The trial drew significant media coverage, particularly because of the 911 call. Hearing a child's voice confessing to such a crime struck a chord with the public. Legal analysts debated whether he should be treated as an adult or given the opportunity for rehabilitation. The jury, however, was tasked only with deciding whether he had committed first-degree murder under Iowa law. In 2013, the court delivered its decision. Noah was found guilty of second-degree murder. The distinction meant that while the killing was intentional, it lacked the full premeditation required for the most serious charge. He was sentenced to up to 50 years in prison, with the possibility of parole after 35. That means Noah, who was just 13 when the crime occurred, will spend the majority of his adult life behind bars before he has any chance of release. For the community, the sentencing was bittersweet. Justice had been served in a legal sense, but the tragedy could never be undone. Gretchen was remembered as a devoted nurse and mother, someone who cared deeply for her son and worked tirelessly for her patients. Her friends and colleagues spoke of her warmth and dedication, qualities that stood in stark contrast to the way her life ended. Today, Noah remains incarcerated in the Iowa prison system. His case is still studied by those who look at juvenile crime, mental health, and family dynamics. It raises painful questions. Could this have been prevented? Were there warning signs that were missed? And how does society balance accountability with the recognition that a 13-year-old is still a child? The story of Noah Crooks is haunting because it combines the innocence of youth with an act that shattered all notions of childhood. It forces us to look at the fragile line between discipline and rebellion, between guidance and resentment. For those who knew Gretchen, the tragedy is that her efforts to raise her son with care and structure ended not in gratitude but in violence. For Noah, it is a lifelong reminder that one moment of anger can alter everything, leaving behind a trail of grief that can never be repaired. Number 8. Michael Carneal. On the morning of December 1st, 1997, the small town of West Paducah, Kentucky, awoke to a scene of unimaginable tragedy. At Heath High School, students were gathering before classes, some chatting with friends, others praying with a student-led group that met each morning. Among them was 14-year-old freshman Michael Carneal, a boy whose name would soon be etched into history as the perpetrator of one of America's earliest modern school shootings. Michael was known to classmates as quiet, awkward, and often the subject of teasing. He came from a stable home with supportive parents, but socially he struggled. He had a few close friends but longed for wider acceptance. Like many teenagers of the time, he played video games, read comic books, and spent time online, where he sometimes exaggerated stories to seem more impressive. Some remembered him as intelligent, while others said he was isolated. What no one realized was how deeply his insecurities and frustrations had begun to build. In the days leading up to that Monday morning, Michael had stolen several firearms from a neighbor and his own family. Hidden inside a blanket roll, he carried them to school. His peers thought the bundle was part of a prank, or perhaps just his belongings. No one imagined what was about to unfold. At around 7:45 a.m., as students stood in a circle praying in the lobby, Michael pulled out a .22 caliber pistol and opened fire. In a matter of seconds, 10 rounds were fired into the crowd. 3 students, Jessica James, Casey Steger, and Nicole Hadley, died at the scene, while 5 others were injured, some critically. The entire school was thrown into chaos as teachers rushed to protect students, and emergency responders flooded the campus. Michael was quickly subdued by school staff. He offered no resistance, dropping the weapon and reportedly appearing dazed by what he had done. Police arrived within minutes, taking him into custody. The images of teenagers crying in disbelief outside their high school were broadcast nationwide, marking one of the first times many Americans confronted the horror of a school shooting carried out by someone so young. The investigation revealed a disturbing level of preparation. Michael had brought multiple guns, including rifles and a shotgun, though he only fired the small pistol. Students later testified that he had spoken about doing something violent, but no one believed him. In fact, some thought he was joking, given his reputation for trying to get attention. That morning, however, his threats became reality. When the case entered the courtroom, it drew immense media coverage. Michael's age became a central focus. At 14, could he be held fully responsible? Prosecutors charged him with 3 counts of murder and 5 counts of attempted murder. His defense argued that he suffered from a mental illness, pointing to psychiatric evaluations that diagnosed him with disorders including paranoia and depression. They claimed he was not fully in control of his actions. In 1998, Michael entered a guilty plea but mentally ill, acknowledging his responsibility while also highlighting his psychological struggles. The court accepted the plea. He was sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 25 years. That sentence reflected Kentucky law, which did not allow life without parole for someone so young. For the families of the victims, the sentence was both a measure of justice and a reminder of what could never be restored. Parents spoke about the futures that had been stolen, young lives full of promise, cut short in an instant. Survivors of the shooting carried not only physical scars, but emotional ones, living with the trauma of that day for the rest of their lives. As the years passed, Michael Carneal's case continued to be revisited, especially as other school shootings occurred in the United States. In 2022, after serving 25 years, he became eligible for parole. At the hearing, survivors and family members testified, urging the board to deny his release. Michael, now in his late 30s, admitted to the panel that he still heard voices and struggled with mental illness. The board unanimously voted to deny parole, ensuring that he will remain in prison for life. Today, Michael remains incarcerated in Kentucky. His case is remembered as one of the first that forced Americans to confront the reality of school shootings, years before Columbine or Parkland. For Heath High School, the scars are permanent. Memorials stand for the victims, and every December 1st, the community gathers to remember those lost and to reflect on the fragility of safety in places once thought secure. The story of Michael Carneal is haunting not only because of the loss of life, but because of his age. At 14, he should have been worried about grades, sports, or fitting in. Instead, he made a choice that destroyed lives, altered his community forever, and began a tragic pattern that the nation continues to grapple with today. Number 9. Jesse Osborne. On September 28, 2016, the small town of Townville, South Carolina, became the site of a tragedy that drew national headlines. At just 14 years old, Jesse Osborne carried out a violent act that began in his own home and ended at an elementary school filled with children. His name is now etched into the history of juvenile crime in America as one of the youngest school shooters in recent memory. Jesse's early life appeared troubled from the start. He was described as quiet, often withdrawn, and sometimes bullied by classmates. Friends later recalled that he could be friendly, but also had a fascination with violence. Online, he posted disturbing comments and shared dark fantasies. His home life was fractured as well. His relationship with his father, Jeffrey Osborne, was complicated. Jesse struggled with feelings of isolation and anger, emotions that would ultimately culminate in tragedy. On that September morning in 2016, Jesse waited for his father to return home. When Jeffrey walked into the garage, Jesse pulled out a handgun and fired. His father died at the scene, and Jesse fled in his truck. What makes the crime even more chilling is what Jesse chose to do next. Instead of running away, he drove to Townville Elementary School, only a few miles from his home, armed with 2 handguns and a plan. At the school, it was a normal day. Children were outside at recess, teachers supervising the playground. Suddenly, Jesse pulled up and began firing into the group. Panic erupted as teachers rushed to shield students. 6-year-old Jacob Hall was struck and fatally wounded, while 2 other students and a teacher were injured. In the chaos, a volunteer firefighter tackled Jesse, restraining him until law enforcement arrived. His rampage had lasted only minutes but left a lifetime of grief. The news spread quickly. A teenager had killed his father and then targeted an elementary school. The story shocked the nation, bringing back painful memories of other school shootings. For South Carolina, it was one of the darkest days in recent memory. the focus immediately turned to Jesse's motives. Investigators discovered a disturbing online trail. He had researched school shootings, idolized past gunmen, and expressed a desire to carry out an attack of his own. Friends later testified that he had spoken about wanting to kill children, but no one believed he was serious. The legal process was lengthy and closely covered by the press. Prosecutors charged Jesse as an adult with murder, attempted murder, and weapons violations. They presented a case showing careful planning and premeditation, emphasizing his online postings and the chilling fact that he had first killed his father before targeting the school. The defense argued that Jesse was mentally ill, struggling with depression and personality disorders. They claimed he did not fully comprehend the weight of his actions and should be considered for treatment rather than life in prison. In 2019, Jesse pleaded guilty to all charges. The courtroom was filled with families of the victims, including Jacob Hall's parents, who spoke about the pain of losing their 6-year-old son. Teachers described the terror of that day and the bravery of those who tried to protect their students. The judge listened to days of testimony before handing down the sentence. Life in prison without the possibility of parole, plus an additional 30 years. Jesse, just a teenager, was condemned to spend the rest of his life behind bars. The ruling reflected the seriousness of his crimes and the devastation they caused. For many, it was a necessary outcome. The community could not risk his release, and the families of the victims needed to see accountability. Still, the case sparked renewed debate about how to handle juvenile offenders who commit adult crimes. Should a 14-year-old be locked away forever, or is there always some potential for rehabilitation? The judge, weighing all the evidence, concluded that Jesse's actions were so severe that society required permanent protection. Today, Jesse Osborne is incarcerated in the South Carolina prison system. His case continues to be discussed in legal circles, particularly when it comes to juvenile sentencing. For the families of the victims, however, the legal questions matter less than the personal loss. Jacob Hall's classmates have grown older, but he will forever remain 6. His parents keep his memory alive with community events and advocacy, ensuring that his short life is never forgotten. The story of Jesse Osborne remains haunting because of its scale and senselessness. A boy, barely a teenager, destroyed not only his own life, but the lives of his father, a child at school, and the innocence of an entire community. It serves as a reminder that danger can emerge even from those who seem too young to comprehend it, and that vigilance, both at home and in schools, is crucial. Number 10. Rashawn Weaver. On a cold December evening in 2019, New York City was stunned by the news that an 18-year-old Barnard College freshman had been attacked in Morningside Park, just blocks away from Columbia University. The victim was 18-year-old Tessa Majors, a promising student who had only recently moved to the city to begin her college life. Within days, investigators revealed something that shocked the public even more. The suspects weren't hardened adult criminals, but teenagers, one of them only 14 years old. His name was Rashawn Weaver. Rashawn grew up in Harlem, attending middle school like any other boy his age. Teachers remembered him as intelligent but sometimes distracted, and neighbors described him as quiet. But his life was far from stable. Reports later showed he had been in and out of the juvenile system, facing difficulties at home and struggling with discipline. Despite being only 14, he was already entangled in a world of delinquency that would ultimately lead to tragedy. On December 11, 2019, Tessa Majors walked through Morningside Park in the early evening. She was a musician, a writer, and a student full of promise. At the same time, Weaver and 2 other boys, both just 13 and 14, were wandering the park. Prosecutors later explained that the group intended to commit a robbery. Armed with knives, they looked for someone vulnerable. When they crossed paths with Tessa, an ordinary walk turned into a confrontation that would leave her fatally injured. According to police and later court testimony, the group surrounded Tessa and demanded her belongings. When she resisted, the situation escalated. She was stabbed multiple times, collapsing on a nearby staircase. Though she managed to stumble toward the street seeking help, she died shortly afterward. Within hours, New York City's major newspapers carried the story, and the city was gripped by grief and outrage. Investigators acted quickly. Surveillance cameras captured images of the boys running from the park. Detectives tracked their movements and soon identified them through witness statements and school records. One 13-year-old was arrested first, leading police to Weaver and another teen. The arrests shocked the city, not just because of their ages, but because of the violence involved. Many struggled to reconcile the idea of children carrying out such a crime in broad daylight. As the case unfolded, the courtroom became the center of attention. Weaver was charged with second-degree murder, robbery, and other offences. Prosecutors emphasized his direct involvement in the stabbing, presenting evidence that included witness testimony and forensic analysis. The defense argued that Weaver was only a child, influenced by peers and incapable of fully understanding the consequences of his actions. His attorneys also pointed to his difficult upbringing, trying to show that he had been shaped by circumstances beyond his control. The hearings drew extensive media coverage. New Yorkers watched closely as prosecutors argued that this was not a case of immaturity or mischief, but a violent crime that had stolen the life of a young woman with limitless potential. Tessa's parents sat through the proceedings, listening as the details of their daughter's final moments were recounted. Their pain and loss became a focal point of the trial. In December 2021, Rashawn Weaver pleaded guilty to second-degree murder and first-degree robbery. During sentencing, the court heard emotional statements from Tessa's family, who described her love of music, her ambition, and the devastation caused by losing her. Weaver himself apologized, telling the court he wished he could undo his actions, but the judge emphasized that the consequences were permanent. Weaver was sentenced to 14 years to life in prison, a punishment that reflected both his youth and the seriousness of his crime. His co-defendant received a lesser but still substantial sentence, while the youngest boy involved was handled in family court because of his age. For Tessa's family, the sentencing provided some measure of justice, but no true relief. Their daughter's future had been stolen in an instant, and no prison term could bring her back. The case sparked widespread debate across New York. Some saw it as a sign of rising youth violence and called for tougher measures, while others pointed to the need for early intervention in troubled children's lives to prevent tragedies like this. For many, it was a reminder of how quickly an ordinary evening in the city could turn deadly, and how even the youngest offenders can inflict irreversible harm. Today, Rashawn Weaver remains incarcerated, serving the first years of what could be decades in prison. He will have the chance to apply for parole after 14 years, but whether he will ever walk free again depends on how the system judges his growth and rehabilitation. For Tessa Major's family, the focus is not on Weaver's future, but on preserving her memory. Friends and classmates continue to honour her with concerts and tributes, celebrating the vibrant young woman who should have had a lifetime ahead of her. The story of Rashawn Weaver closes this series with a sobering reality. A teenager, barely out of middle school, joined in a crime that ended the life of a young woman just beginning hers. It stands as a reminder that choices made in a single moment can alter countless lives, and that behind every headline is a family whose world has been changed forever. 10 young lives, 10 different stories, yet each one left families and communities forever changed. What's most striking isn't just their ages, but the scale of devastation their choices created. These cases remind us that crime doesn't always come from hardened adults. Sometimes it comes from kids who seemed ordinary just days before. So now we want to hear from you. Which of these cases shocked you the most, and why? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Thanks for watching. Stay safe, and we'll see you in the next video.